At this point, talking about Cruelty Squad is not really that uncommon of a topic. The game has actually been brought to the attention of some of the most popular gaming channels on YouTube with millions of views. So, despite its obscure nature and its cryptic symbolism and vague references, it has gotten pretty popular, so it's beyond some abstract piece of art that has been secluded or meant for a specific type of audience that gets it for what it is. Although you can argue just with every piece of media that happens to reach some level of popularity that it's still a small percentage of people that appreciates Cruelty Squad for its approach to themes that have to do with economics and capitalism or its various philosophical questions. Because whether or not this is a deep thought-provoking game or not, one thing is for certain, and that is that it's really easy to grab your attention. The look of the game by itself is extremely surreal, with vivid colors, bizarre mechanics, and just a game that in general makes you go, what the fuck is this? And one of those ways in which the game is successfully able to grab your attention is with its music. And since I've dedicated this channel primarily focusing on music, I believe that the game's soundtrack deserves a mention of its own, since so far it's possibly one of the most standout soundtracks I've heard from a game this decade. That might not necessarily mean much, since I haven't played a lot of 2020's games. There's still a lot that I want to play that are on my wishlist, though I still think that I can say with confidence that this is one of the most intriguing game soundtracks in recent memory. The game is developed by Consumer Softproducts, and it's the same name under the soundtrack. So what is the music of Cruelty Squad all about? Well, that's an interesting question, because on one hand you have really outlandish industrial glitchy tracks. Even the term powered noise is not all that far-fetched on a few occasions. But on the other hand, the more you come to think of it, it's done in a pretty standard sequencer and tracker fashion. The music of Cruelty Squad is pretty interesting, and that's a pretty appropriate word to use for the overall game, in the sense that all of it feels really out of place at first. It will feel overwhelming trying to learn the mechanics and the way it wants you to approach it, and once you get accustomed to it, you can really treat it like another casual FPS that happens to be a bit disorienting at first. That's kind of the same case for the music of this game, and I believe it really helps that it contains some of the most intriguing and most unhinged ideas right from the get-go. I find the level design accustomed to those particular tracks is a really clever way to make a first impression. It might feel toned down later on, but it's mainly because once you get past those first levels, you get desensitized by everything that's going on, though there are still some curveballs being thrown at you that I'm going to mention later. The way it instantly grabs your attention is with the cutscene the moment you start the game, in which you get a quirky ringtone sound so obnoxiously loud you can hear the clipping of the audio file as if it's made intentional for that old school feeling of retro gaming. The clipping is something that is also strongly indicated with pretty much every dialogue sound. The press on up is basically the main menu theme, and it's really appropriate. The minimal synth melodies have this 8-bit aesthetic to them, and it's a really simplistic idea that easily becomes one of the most memorable moments in the soundtrack, and it does have that something that makes it kind of unnerving and dystopian. Memories of HQ is basically like the hub area of the game, and it features another really minimal synth track that is a bit darker and more industrial in its tone. It's meant to be a peaceful place without combat, so we're still getting this more relaxing and soothing aura without going over the top yet, outside of maybe those sound effects that sound like distant barking dogs, and the fact that it all feels like it's inside a facility with high static. It's with the next two tracks of the first combat level, Pharma Creep and Combat Cocktail, in which Cruelty Squad shows you what it's all about. Pharma Creep nicely continues with this soothing era that has been building upon with the previous two tracks, and this is possibly the most peaceful one, while simultaneously containing this distorted bass that adds in a beautiful fashion as a background piece. But anytime an enemy notices you and you get into the action, Combat Cocktail starts playing, which is one of the most unhinged soundtracks in the entire game, one of the most well-made tracks over here, and the main moment where you will get a revelation that even the music doesn't feel right. Now, if you are already accustomed to more experimental and industrial sounds like myself, there's not something particularly convoluted about the structure or the sound design of the track, but it's still pretty interesting to see a track like this in a game, especially if nothing else prior to this was preparing you for this moment. It has this really aggressive distorted bass to it, with tons of industrial soundscapes that become gradually noisier, with a really solid structure and pacing, being able to introduce a lot of cool ideas that make this feel pretty refreshing for a game soundtrack, and also make for a really well crafted standalone track. It's an industrial banger that can get you pumped up for its action sequences. The 180 with the next track, Chanko Pops, is another way of Cruelty Squad messing with your head and subverting your expectations. This is a massive level with a ton of open areas, giving you the ability to drive a car and free roam in a peaceful neighborhood. The soundtrack is extremely cheerful to a somewhat comedic extent, with a mall-type beat with beat crusher effects and just a sub-bass that is used in more high frequencies with a really cheerful melody. My favorite part is the finisher with the lower frequency bass and the whoosh sound effects that at the beginning I thought it was from something in the environment, but you will get a lot of these moments where you kinda wonder which sound is part of the soundtrack and which ones are actual sound effects in the environment. This is one of the aspects I ended up appreciating the most about this soundtrack. At this point, I've pinpointed the main elements that make the Cruelty Squad soundtrack so engaging, and these first tracks make a really good job of highlighting all of the aspects that you would see making their appearance in anything else the soundtrack has to offer. After this point, it's really a matter of preference whether or not you enjoy certain ideas over some others. I believe that after Chanko Pops, you can get a good grasp on what the game and the music are going for, but even with that being said, the difficulty curve just goes higher and higher, so there's still going to be some struggles since this game can be really challenging. With some of the later tracks is where I get accustomed to the overall feel of the game and realize that it's not that far off from some of the weirder sounds that you could get from retro shooters. For example, I think that it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Cruelty Squad takes influences from games such as Doom and Blood or Quake, with all of those games having certain tracks in terms of dark ambient and industrial that would feel kinda out there but appropriate for their dystopian settings. Some of the more laid-back cuts remind me of something that you would get out of Utopian Virtual, a vaporwave subgenre with soothing mall or elevator music type patterns with a sense of nostalgia. Or some of the most intense cuts with the distorted bass coming in contrast with the dungeon synth type melodic instrumentation remind me of what James Ferraro did with the album Terminus. Having all of those potential points of influence in mind, it really makes you understand that Cruelty Squad's soundtrack is not this one-of-a-kind experience to which nothing similar has been done before. It's an amalgamation of many different elements that we usually appreciate being part of a game's soundtrack, and also to me, it's been a way to further appreciate some of the bold artistic choices from the older games that I've mentioned, or the way it captures the essence of a utopian virtual sound in a completely dystopian setting. In a bizarre turn of events, the track Sacrificial Mission decides to be possibly the most haunting moment out of the whole soundtrack. It has this minimal beat, a slightly distorted bass, and a lot of choir type synths playing in reverse, and also being the meat and bones of the melodic aspects. I really like the pacing of the track, even if we're talking about another short segment, which isn't the most fitting in my opinion with the port setting that it takes place, but it's still a really solid moment as a standalone track. I'd say that Steroid Legend is my least favorite track out of the main maps of the game. It is mostly a dark ambient segment that contains a few of the quirks from Pharma Creep, but it's one of the main components where the soundtrack feels the most like it's borrowing elements from retro FPS, and its overall minimalist tone is more to its detriment due to it serving more as background noise without being able to really stand out on its own. It also doesn't really help that this is one of my least favorite levels. It's a convoluted building design without anything that much striking outside of a few rooms with a huge wave of enemies that can demolish you in seconds. The Center City Mega Mall track serves really nice as, a mall track, although it's more ominous than the cheerful tone of Chanko Pops, for example. Due to its minimalism, this works much better in the context of the map, with all of the surrounding sounds from the vending machines, for example. In terms of sound choices, it decides to follow up with certain quirks that have a sense of familiarity to them. The execution is solid, but it doesn't help but feel like something we have accustomed ourselves to previously, with even better overall results. Here's where I think we get to the cream of the crop with the soundtrack, my personal favorite moment, even in terms of the game itself throwing a curveball on the player, as special forces and the police try to mow you down on your apartment with your sole purpose being to kill your landlord and escape. Rent 2 is the only other moment that shares a spiritual successor of Combat Cocktail, with an intense instrumental, noisy segments with abrupt cuts of silence that cover big chunks, whole beat portions. It serves great as an industrial banger. Its intensity has enough adrenaline to get you pumped up in one of the coolest sequences in the whole game, and it even has a segment with lullaby type blacks to catch you off guard. It's also the longest track, going for 3 minutes and having the most fulfilling, fleshed out idea in the whole tracklist. This track is insane and would hope even more ideas would follow this formula. We move on with one of the silliest tracks over here, Sovereign Citizen, taking place in a massive cruise ship and being quite chill in its vibes, with a nice sub-bass and for the most part ideas that are to be expected, but it does have those sound effects playing, especially the second half, which are those like droplets which sound extremely goofy, but at the end of the day they really work to contain a standout aspect that it's easy to grab your attention. You get quickly accustomed to what the track is presenting to you, and it's super fun in its own way. Now I think all of us can agree that with the next one, Toxic Crisis, is where the soundtrack cranks up its weirdness factor up to 11, because what the actual fuck is this? Remember how I said that one of the most intriguing elements about the soundtrack is that at times you can't tell whether the sound effects are part of the music or not. It takes place in a swamp and it sounds like stepping on sludge and toxic waste, and so what you end up doing is that you stop walking so that you make sure the sounds come from the soundtrack and not from your footsteps in the swamp. This is basically like a barrage of sound effects playing in loops, with one segment in the middle having this reverse atmospheric pad, which for me is effectively the most haunting moment out of the whole soundtrack. Now this by itself, there is not much to it. At the context of the map, this is quite appropriate. It's more of like a meme, in the sense that if someone is curious about the game and you want to play a song to them to know what they're in for, this is the most likely pick because of how absurd it is. Wheel of Fortune is a track that I ended up appreciating a lot more than what I initially expected. The synths have this moody tone that is reminiscent of Wave, with an expected dungeon synth and bit crusher undertone. It also contains these goofy sound effects that might work against what the overall track is going for, but in my opinion it still gets the job really well done on having multiple standout moments in its small runtime. It's another solid and memorable track. Control the Population is one of the only forgettable tracks in the main soundtrack for me. Also the same case with this particular level, which was more frustrating rather than enjoyable. This track is soothing and kinda moody with its piano plugs. The background sound effects have an unnerving tone to them, but nothing really stands out at this moment, since the soundtrack has already bombarded you with so many unconventional ideas that this feels kinda lame in comparison. It serves as a pretty standard ambient track with bit crusher effects, and it's just cool for what it is. Divinity of the Office is also borrowing familiar elements with its industrial noisy soundscapes, the distorted beats, and the chorus vocal synths that are reminiscent from those of Sacrificial Mission. Same with the bells as well. The more melodic tone of the second half kind of contradicts what the track was going for at first, but it's not like completely breaking the immersion or anything like that. I feel like if this track was playing earlier in the track listing, it could have a more significant lasting effect, but at this point our familiarity with what the soundtrack is able to pull off and the absurd directions it's willing to go, this track is not doing that much other than being pretty solid. The song of the final map, Punishment, is a really short and quirky, easy listening type track that has a really cool arrangement behind it, but it is a little bit obnoxious. It doesn't help that the final level is by far my least favorite. Its design is so convoluted, like map placements being thrown together, it's hard to figure out where to go, and this track is less than a minute, so you're most likely going to listen to this stupid track a lot of times. Beyond this point, there is bonus material and extra stages which I haven't really been able to unlock, as if you can judge by the gameplay, you can see that I'm not really all that good at this game, and so I didn't really bother to figure out how to unlock this extra content. The first version of the soundtrack contains 3 additional tracks, those being Impenetrable Life, Mid-Toids and Entrapment, with the first 2 being kind of standard Dark Cabin tracks, and Entrapment I think being the end credit song, which is just okay. There would be another version later on that contains even more tracks, but I won't touch upon them, although it's interesting that it includes Shopping for Secrets, the theme that plays when you approach a vending machine. The fundamentals of Cruelty Squad soundtrack are not really that much far off from Dark Cabin and retro FPS foundations, and once you get accustomed to its approaches, you will realize that lots of the sounds presented make their appearance in multiple occasions, but it's those additional quirks and unconventional techniques that prevent the soundtrack of Consumer Softproducts to be a one-trick pony. While the game itself is not, for me at least, the groundbreaking masterpiece that it's being praised as, I can give it credit for being one of the prime examples of creativity from indie development, taking risks that feel way too unconventional for AAA titles, and also being able to encompass this madness with one of the most consistently solid soundtracks to come out in recent memory. And this is why the Cruelty Squad soundtrack is, in my opinion, an essential. Let me know your thoughts of this game or soundtrack down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.